All right, we are live. Today is Monday, March the 7th, 2016, and welcome to our Sound for Video Help session today. We have a couple of things we're going to talk about. Actually, the main thing we're going to talk about is music and mixing music as a music bed underneath the dialogue, which is a fun thing to do, to bring music. Music can actually a whole lot, of course, to your piece, and there are lots of considerations there. This was actually a question that was brought up by our friend Mark Latani. I don't think he's here today. I think he'll be watching later. But the question he asked was a good one, and that question was, good morning, Curtis. At one of your online sessions, could you please discuss how to process pre-recorded royalty-free music in Audition to be added to a Final Cut Pro 10 project? Now, this could apply to any nonlinear editor. It's not specific to Final Cut Pro 10. He attached a sample file. In this particular case, it happens to be that it was royalty-free, so it was delivered as an MP3 file. And he asked some specific questions. Does it need to be tweaked to match your suggested dialogue loudness settings, or can it be imported directly? So we'll address that, first of all, as a loudness question. And then secondly, would it benefit from being converted to a .wav or a WAV file at 48 kilohertz? So let's go ahead and take a look at this file really quickly, and let's learn some things here. Actually, before I do that, let me just share my screen here really quickly and show you something. So here is I don't have any sort of relationship with these guys, but Premium Beat is a company that will from which you can buy royalty-free music tracks to use in your videos. There are lots of others as well. Another one that I've used in the past is Warner Chappell. They have an incredibly large library of music you can choose from. If you're a musician yourself, of course, you can do your own. I think, Rick, that may be something you could create your own music.
It's good and bad because if you're a musician, you spend too much time trying to compose the right music instead of just taking something stock. So it makes a disadvantage.
It's an advantage and a disadvantage. You can create the right piece, but on the other hand, and this is a challenge I think that plenty of us have fallen into before, you could come over here, for example, to Premium Beat, and you could easily kill 2 or 3 hours just looking for the right track. So I guess it goes both ways. The thing I do like, I've used Warner Chappell, which is a big one. Premium Beat I kind of like because their user interface is pretty nice. As you listen to songs, you can kind of put them into different lists, so you know to come back to them. So as you're trying to kind of find that right track for your piece, it makes it a little easier to come back to it. Also, of course, they deliver the highest quality file types in terms of audio, so you can get a raw WAV file, or others as well. You can also get an MP3, but I would again avoid getting an MP3 if you can. You probably want to go with a WAV file. All right. With that said, let's pull up an Audition here and let me share that with you. Stop sharing that and let's start sharing. Okay, there we go. So this is the file that Mark sent over, and again, it's an MP3 file. It actually sounds okay. From my point of view, I think it's an acoustic guitar and sort of other acoustic instrument type piece. I could definitely see it working well for the right kind of piece. And it's a fine file. There are a couple of things to notice here. If you look, and it's hard to see because the screen's so big, I'm moving my mouse here. Look down here. Down here, it gives you the sample rate. So right now, it's at 44,100 hertz or 44 kilohertz. And bringing it into Adobe Audition took the MP3 file and it put it in a 32-bit space. So it's going to do the processing at 32-bit, but it started as an MP3 file. So it's already operating with a smaller.
Okay. Hey, Curtis, I can't see your screen.
Oh, we're not seeing the screen. Okay, let's try that again.
There it is.
Okay. Here we go. My apologies. Let's start over there. So down here, you can see I'm moving my mouse. In Adobe Audition, down here on the bottom, it will tell you the sample rate. So here we have, again, as I said, this is a 44.1 kilohertz sample rate track. And one of the questions Mark asked was, well, should I convert that to 48 kilohertz? Well, that's a big question, and it's actually a fairly challenging one. I think we're going to need to come back to that question in more detail later. What I would say at this point is it's going to depend. If you do change that, you're going to be doing some resampling, and resampling can do bad things to the audio. So there are lots of options when you do resample, and for example, if I were just to save this as a WAV file, let's just change this here to WAV PCM. You can also change the sample rate here if you wanted to. And if you do that, you want to come down here into the advanced. You're going to have a few different types of dithering available to you. And again, this is where I said this is kind of a big topic, and I think we need to address this separately. But in an ideal situation, you won't want to mess with the sample rate. You want to leave it where it is. However, we may potentially have an issue here. There are two other things to keep in mind. Number one, where is this going to be published or broadcast? If it's going to go to YouTube, for example, it turns out that YouTube automatically resamples your audio to 44.1 kilohertz if it's not already 44.1 kilohertz anyway. So if that's the case, then you'd probably want to just leave this as is. Now, you'll also probably have dialogue in your piece, and if you do, and it's shot at 48 kilohertz, then you may want to resample the dialogue down to 44.1 kilohertz so it all matches, so you can do the resampling and you're not going to have to rely on YouTube or whatever other service you're using to do that for you. And again, as I said, we'll come back to resampling at another point. But I would say this, Mark, in relation to your question and for everyone else here, I wouldn't automatically resample this to 48 kilohertz unless you have an absolute, a reason to do that. So that's the first thing. Now, in terms of loudness, let's just take a quick look here. So if I come over here to my amplitude statistics, if I don't have that, I can just bring it up here under the window menu, amplitude statistics. And if I just tell it to scan the audio file, it's going to give us a reading here. And you can see our ITU-R BS 1770-3 loudness, which is a mouthful. This is actually reading at minus 14.31 LUFS. Now, remember that usually when we're publishing to the web and the video is going to be consumed or watched, if you will, viewed on devices that don't have the best audio playback, typically for a stereo file like this, I'm aiming for this loudness to be at minus 16 or somewhere maybe in the minus 16.5 range, which is usually what I aim for, somewhere in that range. So this is actually running a little loud from the start. And we haven't even mixed it with dialogue yet. So I would say first things is that I'd probably want to pull this one back a little bit because, again, even if it's the only thing that's going to be in the piece, maybe behind some B-roll or whatever it is, you probably want to cool this off a little bit. It's just running a little too hot. And the way I would do that is I'd drag this down into the match loudness panel. I would set my target loudness. Again, this is going to depend on a lot of different things, but if I were going to have this as the only audio behind, again, some footage of whatever sort, I would set this to minus 16. I'd leave my tolerance at 0.5 loudness units, and I'd put my max true peak at minus 1.5. Let me talk about these others just a little bit. The tolerance is just how strict you want it to be about matching that target. 0.5 seems reasonable. So if it's off by half a loudness unit, I'm okay with that. It's not that big of a deal. But as far as max true peak, I'm kind of particular about that. So what we're going to do is, because we're going to be cutting this in with a video piece, I'm actually going to save this as a WAV file so that I don't lose any more information until the final export. Because again, MP3 format is a lossy format. You wouldn't want to save it again as an MP3, then cut it into your film, and then export, because you're going to go through two more lossy cycles where it's actually going to throw information out and the quality of the audio is going to degrade. So we're going to go WAV, and in that light, because I'm going to WAV first, I need to make sure that I have enough headroom so that when we do that final export of the video, you sometimes lose this headroom. And so that's why I usually go for a true peak target of minus 1.5. And so this is actually pretty strict about this. This is going to say, don't make any of the peaks, any of these peaks here. Don't let them be any higher than minus 1.5. And that's not going to be a problem for us here because we're essentially attenuating this signal here. We're going to make it quieter. And in that process, I think we're going to go ahead and get our additional headroom we need to meet this max true peak level. So we'll go ahead and run that. And let's see what happens. This is a kind of a longer piece. Take it a couple seconds. All right. You can see minus 1.5. Again, I'm shaking my pointer. It's right here. That's going to be somewhere in this area here. And it looks like, just visually, that we're doing okay there. But what we can do is, again, come up to our amplitude statistics, and let's rerun this. Okay, our loudness is now minus 16 LUFS on the dot. And it turns out our true peak amplitude on the left channel is minus 1.87. Good. We're lower than 1.5, minus 1.5. And on the right channel, it's minus 2.44. So we're all good there. So that's the first step. If I were just, again, going to play this music behind some footage, and I wasn't going to have any dialogue or other sound effects or anything else going on at the same time, this is probably what I would aim for if it were going to be something that was going to be broadcast to the web, which a lot of video is these days. Now, if you're going to television broadcast or something else, those targets are a little different, and you need to look and see what those are in your particular area. In Europe, it's generally minus 23 LUFS. In the United States, it's generally minus 24 LUFS. For web, the most common recommendation I've seen is minus 16, and that's generally what I publish at. So that works pretty well. So that would be the first thing that you would want to do, is you'd want to cool it off a little bit. So yeah, you would want to do the loudness normalization. In this particular case, it's a little bit different than most of the cases we've talked about in the past, because in this case, we're actually reducing the loudness as opposed to maximizing the loudness. So that's kind of it's actually kind of common with music. You'll find that a lot of times music is a lot hotter. Because there, for years and years and years, in radio broadcast and even to recorded music for distribution via CD or even electronic format, the loudness standards are different, and there's been an ongoing war, if you will, that many people refer to as the loudness war, where people try to get as much as they possibly can in terms of loudness into their music, so they do crazy things to make that happen. This was actually one of the saner music tracks that I've encountered, again, probably because it's an acoustic piece. So anyway, that's the first step that I would take there. Now, if this was something that was going to be sitting behind dialogue, there might be some other additional things you would want to do. And let's just run through a couple of those really quickly. So if it's sitting behind dialogue, the most obvious thing you could do is you could highlight the whole thing, and you could do this in your video editing app as well. And I'll show you that in just a minute here. But you could just attenuate. You could just reduce it overall, and meets whatever you want to do. Let's go ahead and run the statistics on that again and see. That puts us at a loudness of minus 28.3 LUFS. That would probably sit behind dialogue okay. And that's one thing you could do, but there are some better things you can do, actually. And let me just show you what those are. So here, for example, let's go ahead and export this file as a WAV file at this point. So I'm going to save as, because we're going to take it over into our video editing app. Let's change this to WAV. We're going to leave it at 44.1 kilohertz. And I'll go ahead and save that. Okay. Now, I am going to pull up let's go into Final Cut Pro. We could do the same exact thing in Premiere. Give that just a second to come up here. Okay, here's a funny frame. Here's a video I published just this weekend here. But let me find a spot where I could drop this in. Actually, you won't be able to hear it anyway. That's unfortunate. I'm still trying to work out how to get the sound from my computer into a Google Hangout. still working on it. We'll get there at some point. I appreciate your patience on that. But what I would do here is in Final Cut, and again, similar principle if you're talking about Premiere Pro. Here's our WAV file. I'll just go ahead and pull that in. Let's see, where did it put it? Here it is right here. Say I wanted to just drop it underneath this dialog here. So I might put it right there. All right, now the first thing I could do is, again, I could just drop the level in here. So in Final Cut Pro, it's pretty much you just grab this and you can pull it down by however much you need to. That's one thing you can do. But something that's even more effective than that, or in addition to that, that you might want to do, is actually add an EQ effect on that. So let's come over here to our effects. Whoops. And I am going to look for our audio effects. And here we have some EQ filters. So we have a few different options. There's some built-in ones. You can use any one you like. These are the ones that are built into Final Cut Pro. Let's see if I can find one. I don't typically use those. Here's some from Logic. I don't have Logic, but these were actually on here. I'm just going to drop this on here and let's see what that one looks like. So once I have that on that clip, I come over here into my inspector and I have this fat EQ. This is kind of a clunky interface, but it would work for sure. Let's use one that's a little bit more visual oriented. Again, you could do this with any EQ plugin. It's not, it doesn't have to, there's no one magic plugin you should use, but let me just use this one just because it's more visually oriented. And here I can bring up the interface. Okay, so here we have just a parametric EQ. So I have all these different control points. I can use these to boost or cut at different frequencies. Let's go ahead and let me just show you a preset that I made for this called Cut Music for Voice. And you can see what it's done here. If I select that, it's just taken this one point and it's done a pretty deep cut, a pretty wide cut as well. So it's reducing this by 4 dB and it's centered at 1.5 kilohertz, but it's really, really wide. You can see here I can actually change the what's called the Q or the width. And you can see I did a really, really wide cut. Now let me explain kind of the principle here, what I'm trying to accomplish here. Essentially what I'm doing here is I'm taking the music and I'm cutting this swath out of it. And I'm cutting a lot of the mid-range stuff out and a little bit of the really high frequency stuff and a little bit of the low frequency stuff as well. And I'm doing that by about 4 dB. Normally, most people can hear a perceptual change when you do a cut or a boost of 3 dB. So in this case, we're doing a cut of minus 4 dB. So that's perceptual. Most people can hear the difference when you do that. And that's pretty much, it's mild, but it's enough that it makes a difference. And so again, what I'm doing is I'm essentially pulling all of this information out of the music track because this is where the dialogue is going to sit for the most part. This is where most of the dialogue happens in these frequencies here. So by doing this cut in the music, we're pulling the music back just in this center area to make room for the dialogue to sit there. And actually, this is a trick that most mixers and mastering engineers use when they're actually mixing music to make room for the various instruments. So they'll actually take a bass drum, for example, and roll everything off that's up at the high end. And depending on what kind of bass is in that song as well, they may actually even roll off some of the low end as well. Again, essentially carving out a space for each of the instruments. In this case, we're carving out the music to make space for the dialogue. So again, you could use any EQ for this. There's nothing magical about this particular one. It's just visually easier to work with when I'm trying to do a description here of what's going on. So that's probably the second thing I would do. I would actually use this EQ if I'm going to be running background music behind some dialogue. And then from there, once I've applied that, then I would probably tweak the overall level of that music track to bring it down to a point where it works well behind the dialogue in whatever the type of piece you're doing, and how present or not present you want that music to be. I often find that to make the kind of maximize the intelligibility of dialogue, but just leave a hint of the music, I usually drop this down, the music down, Once I've normalized it to minus 16, I drop it down to about minus 23 dB. That's just a rule of thumb. It depends on so many other things. Don't use that as a hard and fast rule, but as a starting point. And again, it's going to depend on your particular piece, your tastes, how you want to do it. So those are some things to keep in mind. Again, when you're mixing music with as a sort of a background or as a music bed, if you will, to dialogue.
Curtis, I think you did a YouTube video on this maybe around 6, 8 months ago?
Yes, yeah, it's
Okay,
true.
so I remember that, but I don't know if you can put a link to that with when you post the archive. But I remember that video, and I could really hear the difference on the before and after.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, I'll go ahead and put a link for that. That's a great idea, Rick. Thanks for that. Yeah, and if that goes into probably a little bit more detail than we'll have a chance to hear today. All right, let's see here. Let's okay, so just kind of to recap that process that we went through. So first what we did is we had the MP3 file, which was a royalty free. Again, if you can get your hands on
Te
the
llamo
original,
Belén.
that's going to be ideal. And
Sorry.
no worries. So if you can get your hands on the original, that's probably the number one thing you'll want to do. And then from there, where'd my stuff go? Audition. Yes. So get your hands on the original if you can, preferably a WAV file, preferably with the sample rate. You don't typically get to choose that. My experience has been that a lot of the audio that you'll download when you buy it, the stock music, say for example from Premium Beat or Warner Chappelle or whatever other place you go to out there, typically it's going to be 48 kilohertz. Sometimes it's 44.1 kilohertz. Just depends on the particular piece. Almost always stereo, but again, I would go for the wave. I would take care of the loudness first of all, because even at the max, I wouldn't really want it for a video piece that I'm going to publish to the web. I wouldn't want it to be sitting a lot louder than minus 16. That's my personal thing. The good thing is if you do that, if you get it to minus 16 LUFS and you have a true peak of minus 1.5, like we do in this case here, you're going to be safe. You're not going to get a bunch of distortion and crazy stuff going on when people play it back. So that's definitely my first step. Once I've done that, I export it as a WAV file. Again, not changing the sample rate if I don't have to for whatever reason. I then bring it into my video editing app, and in this case we used Final Cut. You could use Premiere, you could use any other video editing apps as well. Once I get the sound or the music beneath the dialogue that I want it to sit behind, I then use the EQ filter, and let's just pull that up again. Again, cutting out a large swath centered around about 1.5 kilohertz. And we'll put a link to that video where we've got to talk about that in more detail. There are some other things too, and in fact, let me just show those to you here. The way, as you've probably seen some of those videos before, lots of other people do this. I do it as well. But typically on my little intro piece, I will have some dialogue with a little bit of music behind, and you can see here I dropped it to minus 24 dB. I also applied the EQ filter, so if we look, yeah, you can see that EQ filter has been applied here. That's while I'm talking. Once I come to the actual bumper, there is no dialogue, and in that case, this one was a special case. I actually dropped this a little bit in terms of its overall level, and it's not showing it. I think this one's at minus 9 dB. There's a reason for that. That's a little bit more complicated. I'll come back to that if we have time. But I did not apply the EQ filter there, and then as soon as I start talking again, we've applied the EQ. Again, that sort of mid-frequency kind of scoop. Well, scoop is typically actually a narrower band, but we did this whole swath in the middle. And then, let's see. Yeah, and then you can also see that I dropped it again, at this case, to minus 26 dB, and then applied a fade. It's a really long fade. I probably could have cut that shorter, but I just put a really long fade in there so the music just slowly fades out. So it's already really quiet, but it's going to get quieter, quieter, quieter until it completely disappears, and it'll be kind of subconscious for the viewer. So that's often how I will use music. in my video pieces. Oh, look at that. There's an endorsement for Final Cut Pro 10. It just crashed. I guess we were stressing it a little too much.